Hey, Josh, good to see you. Congrats on the new book, by the way.
Oh, thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate that. It's out in March 18th. Israel and Civilization: The Fate of the Jewish Nation, The Destiny of the West. Available for pre-order on Amazon everywhere books are sold. It should be a fun one.
All right, guys, we'll put the link in the chat and in the show description so you can go out there and order Josh's book. But obviously, if you've listened to Josh's commentary in the past, you can expect a great discussion in that book. So I'm looking forward to it. I want to jump right into a couple things. I want to talk about nominations in a minute and go there, but there's two things that I want to get to before. We saw this sentencing of President Trump on Friday. And as a fake lawyer, and I mean someone who's never taken a legal class but I do watch a lot of Law and Order. I didn't understand. I was like, okay, if the judge was this just a show? If it felt like to me, the Judge Marchand just wanted his 15 minutes of fame. Like it was like, I'm not going to make you come into the court. I'm not going to impose a sentence, but I want to be able to say publicly that you're guilty or something. I didn't understand it.
Well, that makes a lot of us who didn't fully understand what exactly happened in Juan Merchan's courtroom on Friday. I mean, I guess this was Juan Merchan facing reality, the most that he's been forced to face reality over the entire multiple years of this entirely drawn out, Stalinist, fabricated, manufactured proceeding. I mean, the number of times that Juan Merchan should have dismissed this case, should never have been on this case. I mean, I wouldn't even know where to begin. He never should have been the judge over this case. I mean, the case never should have been brought in the first
Right.
case, Sean, as you and I both know. Alvin Bragg's own predecessor, Cy Vance Jr., a progressive prosecutor in his own right, he declined to bring these charges on these grounds because he said it's a legal stretch. Alvin Bragg is Soros funded. He campaigns on getting Trump. He had no such compunctions. So then even conceding for the sake of argument that this prosecution got off to the races, which again, it should not have, but just conceding that, Merchan never should have been the judge in the first place because he literally donated $20 to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden back in 2020. He earmarked that donation, said, get Trump. His daughter, Lauren Merchan, works for Authentic Campaigns, which is a progressive political advocacy and fundraising company. She was literally raising dollars off of the fact that her daddy was supposed to be the first judge to sentence a former, and as the case may be, future president of the United States. In his jury instructions back in May, he did something that I have never, ever seen ever in a criminal proceeding, where he told the jurors that they actually did not have to reach unanimity. They did not have to reach consensus as to what they were convicting the defendant of. To this day, Sean, this is the single most astounding thing to me. To this day, I want to underscore this point. We do not know what Alvin Bragg, Matthew Colangelo, and the Manhattan DA's purported legal theory of this case is, because they actually, to this day, have not spelled it out. We know that it is 34 counts of New York fraudulent corporate bookkeeping in furtherance of ... And then that furtherance of Merchan told the jurors, well, there's 3 or 4 possibilities, and you don't have to agree as to what it is. That is a glaring 5th, 14th Amendment due process clause violation. So there's so many problems here. There should have been a mistrial in light of the Trump versus United States Supreme Court opinion back in July there, where they said that there are large swaths of things that a president does that get you immunized from prosecution. Among those things are when a president discusses and communicates in a general chain of commands hierarchy with people within his own DOJ, within his White House. Well, among those people were both Hope Hicks and Madeleine Westerhout, who the prosecution called as witnesses in this case. Therefore, because of that poisonous fruit, so to speak, this should have been declared a mistrial in the first place. So I mean, on and on and on and on it goes here. I mean, it's a comical just string of errors here. So finally on Friday, after rejecting all the various motions to reject, which he should have accepted all along there, he finally basically throws up his hands and says, okay, we're going to do this thing called unconditional discharge. What the heck is unconditional discharge? I went to University of Chicago Law School. I never heard this term in my entire life. I guess that it is a somewhat abstruse legal term of art in New York criminal procedure, which basically means that nothing happens other than the fact that you are a quote-unquote convicted felon, at least until you get your right of appeal. So, in summation, Sean, we have now wasted, from the beginning of Alvin Bragg's investigation, I count roughly 2.5 to 3 years of New York City taxpayer-funded investigation, prosecution, witnesses, travel, hotel, all of it. All of this been funded by a taxpayer in order to get the quote-unquote right to call Donald Trump a quote-unquote convicted felon for like a few weeks, a few months at the most, until this garbage prosecution is inevitably overturned on appeal.
Okay, so let me just walk through a couple things because I really do find this thing fascinating. But the first thing that came to mind is when Judge Marchand was lecturing Donald Trump. He said, if your name wasn't Donald Trump, if you wouldn't be getting this kind of treatment, if you weren't the president elect, you wouldn't, we'd be instituting a criminal punishment. And I kept thinking to myself, if your name wasn't Donald Trump, this would have never been brought against you, right? They had to manufacture a new statute of limitations that had expired. I thought when Trump talked to the judge, it was so brilliant the way he said it. He goes, basically, I, I'm being convicted of a bookkeeping internal, like these are my books, not yours, not public. I wrote in my book that I paid a legal expense, which is what I did. I paid a lawyer a legal expense, and you're convicting me for this. And Marchand is going off that if it wasn't for you being basically president-elect, you'd be getting a sentence. And I kept thinking in the back of my head, if you weren't Donald Trump running for president, you would have never had this case brought up in the first place for a myriad of reasons.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's a very astute observation, actually. I mean, of course, this case never would have brought. I mean, nor would any of these cases. None of the various tentacles of the Democrat lawfare complex, very much including the other case currently happening in New York State, the Tish James case, a somewhat similar legal issue involving alleged corporate fraud on behalf of the Trump organization for having the temerity, for having the chutzpah to do business with sophisticated financial institution counterparties like Deutsche Bank, which, oh, by the way, Deutsche Bank actually so enjoyed doing business with the Trump organization. In that particular case, they wanted to do more business. Nonetheless, the Attorney General of New York State, Tish James, says that they were allegedly wronged. It's not entirely clear how this was the case. Deutsche Bank, the other banks are saying, what are you talking about? We got our money. They paid us on time there. So, I mean, none of these cases, Sean, none of them would have been brought if it were anyone other than Donald Trump. That obviously is the point, very much including the E. Jean Carroll case, the defamation case, this Bergdorf Goodman alleged groping or something in a changing room 30 years ago. I mean, how the statute of limitations not passed on that one continues to boggle my mind as well there. But this case really, this particular case, the so-called hush money case involving Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen, this really was the lowest of the low. I mean, if you were to single out, I think, one particular case, the Tish James case is up there too. But these two cases really are the most sordid, the most egregious of "show me the man, I will find you" the crime situation. The old Levantry Beria quote, Stalin's right-hand guy back in the KGB from the 1950s there. These two people, Tish James and Alvin Bragg, they literally campaigned for office on the campaign trail, said, vote for me, put me into office, and I will bring you Donald Trump in handcuffs. What kind of country is this? I mean, what kind of country is this that we have but people of the law? I mean, what happened to Elliot Ness, the old FBI agents back in the day, the old law enforcement guys who were getting Al Capone there? I mean, what happened to the nobility of the law enforcement profession in America? Now you have people like Tish James and Alvin Bragg literally saying we're going to get Trump no matter what there. It's really, 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 really sad, sick, and twisted stuff. What they have done to this country, Sean, I fear that we are not going to know the full repercussions of it for a very, very, very long time. Because when you have people like me, who clerked on federal court of appeals, who speak at law schools, who publish legal scholarship. I mean, when I am here saying that I have lost significant faith in the American legal system, frankly, in the Constitution to a small extent itself there, that's a very difficult thing to recover from. It makes me very sad to say these things, frankly.
All right, so I want you to just two more things before we move on. You mentioned, okay, so he is a convicted felon. The media loved to say that on Friday.
Yep.
What consequences does that bring in terms of voting, the consequences of having a criminal record for now? Maybe I know there was some discussion about whether someone could own a gun if they were a convicted felon, et cetera. And then secondly, just address the appeals process and the likelihood of this all being overturned.
So very little in the way of tangible ramifications. So Donald Trump formally moved his residence, his domicile, while he was president from New York State to Florida, where I live. And here in Florida, there are not really major issues when it comes to convicted felons voting or anything like that. For better or for worse, Florida did pass a constitutional amendment generally liberalizing that particular issue. Furthermore, this is actually a very active area of Second Amendment jurisprudence. A lot of the courts are actually dealing with this issue in real time as to whether or not nonviolent felons retain Second Amendment rights. The evolving consensus in the lower courts of appeal, and SCOTUS will eventually have to solidify this at a national level, but the rapidly evolving consensus, there was actually literally literally a case on this out of Pennsylvania, the Third Circuit, like a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. This is very current stuff, actually. But the current consensus is that if you are a non-violent felon, then you do not forfeit your right to own firearms or anything like that. So the tangible, relevant application of Donald Trump being a quote-unquote convicted felon is basically going to mean that Joy Reid and Rachel Maddow and Maureen Dowd can call him that until it's overturned on appeal. And speaking of that appeal, so Donald Trump is going to have the ability to appeal here in both the New York State judicial system, and if he wants to try and take it back to the federal courts, ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court, he will have the ability to do that as well. This is part of the short-sightedness, frankly, of the 5 justices in that late order on Thursday night, unfortunately, including both Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett. I think it's short-sighted because, you guys are basically punting. You're saying go right ahead, but there's a very, very good chance that this is going to end right back on your desk, sooner rather than later in the first place, because in addition to the glaring due process clause 14th Amendment issue that I mentioned earlier when it comes to the jury instructions, things like that there's also a glaring Article 6 supremacy clause issue. Donald Trump, in 1 week, is going to be the president of the United States. Article 6 of the Constitution makes very clear that federal laws, including the Constitution, are the supreme law of the land. If Democrats want to litigate that, I suppose we can have that conversation. From my perspective, that litigation was the United States Civil War, and the supremacy clause, the federal government won that side of the conflict. So the federal government and the federal laws are the law of the land. Sean, what is part of the Constitution? Article 2, the article that establishes the presidency. How can the president engage in wielding the quote-unquote executive power when he is subjected to criminal prosecution there in New York State? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever there. So I think that the Supreme Court is going to ultimately have to toss this on whether it's 14th Amendment due process clause grounds, whether it's Article 6 supremacy clause grounds. Maybe his lawyers will first pursue an appeal in the New York State judicial system to try to get it overturned on the erroneous application of the New York State substantive law, on the erroneous application of this ridiculous fraudulent bookkeeping statute there, or he might try to kind of fast track this thing to SCOTUS. I think both those options are available, but one way or the other, this thing will get overturned, mark my words.
In the meantime, because he's a Florida resident, can he still vote down there?
I believe he can, yes.
Okay. All right. Before I hit confirmation, one more thing that I want to touch base on. The court heard this TikTok case, right? So the law passed by Congress, signed into law by the president, says that TikTok needs to either be divested or banned in the U.S. That's the law of the land. TikTok went to the Supreme Court, tried to make this a free speech issue. Tell me what your read was of the proceedings, because interestingly, all of these Supreme Court watchers really tried to make the case that, the court was skeptical of TikTok's arguments. What was your read on this?
So it's an interesting situation because on Friday at oral argument, you had one of the most brilliant conservative attorneys in the country, Noel Francisco, who I've known on and off for some years now, who was defending TikTok. And you had the Biden administration Solicitor General Liz Prelogar, who conservatives have been rooting against for many years now, taking the side of defending the statute. But I think many conservatives, frankly, including myself, nonetheless found ourselves kind of more sympathetic, actually roles reversed in this particular case, to the administration and less so to former Solicitor General Noel Francisco. Sean, I'll be very honest with you. I actually view this, legally speaking, as a fairly open and shut case. It kind of boggles my mind, the notion that a foreign corporation, really of any kind, let alone one controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, could have a First Amendment right in these United States. Now, you and I have a First Amendment right to speak our mind, but we don't have a First Amendment right to use every possible intermediary or every possible outlet, every possible internet channel there. That's just not how the First Amendment works at a fundamental level. And from what I could tell from the oral argument, I think you saw similar questions along those lines from Justice Alito in particular there, Justice Kavanaugh, probably Chief Justice John Roberts as well there. So I think that the statute is going to be upheld. I mean, it has to happen this week because the deadline is January 19th. So that decision is going to come the next 2-3 days, probably at the absolute most there. I think it's probably going to be a fairly lopsided decision, to be honest with you. If I had to guess, probably 6-3, 7-2, maybe even 8-1 there. But I think that TikTok is going to lose this case.
Who would be the one or the two among the justices, the liberal justices or the conservative justices?
I could see Neil Gorsuch defending TikTok. He is probably the most libertarian-leaning of the justices, probably the most likely of them to make a very, very strong quasi-absolutist First Amendment free speech clause claim there. I'm not sure that he would, to be honest with you, but he strikes me as at least one of the likelier ones to do so. And, when it comes to folks like Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sonia Sotomayor, I mean, I would be a fool if I tried to predict what they're going to do basically on any given day, ending in Y.
Yeah, I heard some of the arguments, and I'm thinking to myself, to your point, like, this isn't we're not limiting their ability to speak. We're limiting their ability to collect data on the citizens of the United States to use to manipulate them going forward. And they're coming in. TikTok is not the same TikTok in China. They won't show their own citizens what they show us. They're looking to manipulate us, to gather information on us. And one of the things that was really interesting, and I think it was Justice Kavanaugh that brought this up, was he was basically saying, hey, look, we're gonna gather up all this information on every one of these kids. And in the future, we'll now have a dossier on them that we could come to them and say, hey, I saw you, Josh Hammer, applying for a job. Gosh, we remember back in 10 years ago, you posted all this stuff on TikTok, or you looked at this video. We're going to publish this all if you don't do X or whatever. And it really is. I don't think people fully appreciate what this means for our future if TikTok were to gather all the data that they are and use it against us.
No, it's very harrowing stuff. Look, the analogy that I've drawn repeatedly on my first TV podcast, America on Trial, with Josh Hammer, is I analogize this to what would have happened at the height of the Cold War. I mean, during kind of, Sputnik and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the space race and all that there. I mean, would we have possibly said that Russian propaganda, that the literal Pravda from Moscow had an unvarnished First Amendment right to disseminate its newspapers in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. and New York City? I mean, the question answers itself. I mean, that's ludicrous stuff, frankly, there, right? I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever, honestly. So I think TikTok's going to lose. And look, frankly, the fact that TikTok as a company is taking the litigation this far, as opposed to just being sold from ByteDance to a company that's in any country in the world other than 4. If memory serves, the statute in question that Congress serves in that Joe Biden signed, it literally only singles out, I think, 4 countries. It basically said that if you are owned by these 4 countries and you are a technology platform, social media platform, then we're not going to allow that. It's literally China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. I'm pretty sure those are the 4. So it says a lot about TikTok that they're not willing to just seek a purchaser in one of the other, 200 plus countries in the world and take this thing as far as they are.
Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.